All right. So, good afternoon, everybody. Let's call the meeting to order. And Councilman Shaib, you look appropriate today with your ribbon and all. Would you bring a few words, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And yesterday we commemorated the 21st anniversary of 9/11. And I want to turn our attention to those men and women who died in that terrible episode, and to the brave men and women of the New York Fire Department, New York Police Department, who sacrificed trying to help others. And we can keep them in our thoughts and our prayers, and let their memory never fade from our hearts and our minds. And also our prayers to our friends across the pond. Great Britain lost a true leader, a woman who was 96 years old, but conducted herself always as a lady, and was a hallmark of the British Empire. And I feel for them, because she was their keel for such a long time, and I think they'll be going through a transition period. So we'll keep our friends in our prayers as well. And we think about all those souls who have given their lives for the benefit of our country and our city. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for that. We entertain the approval of the minutes of July 18th and August 15th of 2020. Probably moving second. Any question on those minutes? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Item C, request to set a public hearing on the closing and abandonment of portion of North Sterling Drive. Who's going to address that?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. North Sterling Drive is a street off of Willow Lake Drive over on James Island, and a portion of it is unpaved. This is a road which the city accepted from the county, and it's unimproved. I think Julia's going to share the screen with us here, where you can see this area right here. And there's actually a little, it's like a dike or a dam here, and it's unimproved. And we've received a request to have a closing of that portion of that road. And what we'd like to do is set a public hearing for the first city council meeting in October, which will give us time to get comments from neighbors and also the city departments, which this could affect. So we would request that you allow us to set that public hearing for the October, I believe it's the 11th city council meeting.
All right, what's the pleasure of the committee? Yeah, Councilman Appel, you got a motion?
Public road on James Island, what could go wrong?
Wait a minute.
We want to try to do our due diligence, Councilmember Appel, just to make sure that we don't have that. That's why we're asking for a little bit of time to make sure we get all comments from people.
I'm sorry, I just have a twisted sense of humor.
Oh yeah.
I think setting a public hearing makes a lot of sense. We'll get the public input and we'll go from there.
All right, so we have a motion.
Second.
Ms. Cook.
Councilmember Parker had her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Council Lady Parker.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry to jump in again on this committee. I just saw that this was on the agenda.
No, that's great.
I met with these homeowners a while back, and if I hadn't looked at this agenda, I wouldn't have known that this was on tonight, tonight's agenda or tomorrow night's agenda. So I definitely would like to talk to you, Mr. O'Brien, further about what was presented. Did you have further communication with the community regarding this?
We've received a petition, Councilmember Parker, from I believe it's 7 property owners over there, 2 of which are city residents, 5 are members of the county. But we've received that, and they've asked for this portion. We've been out there, Matt Altop and I have been out there and looked at the road, and there's some issues they've had with some people dumping out there, which we've been trying to correct also. But that's the only thing we've had, and our normal process would be to send out to city departments that could adversely affect fire, police, public service, and also to get input from the neighbors. So obviously we would be contacting you. And what I usually do in a situation like this, I would send a letter to all the adjoining property owners to give them an opportunity to know this, so nobody's caught by surprise.
Okay, well, so this just caught me by surprise a little. That's why I'm sharing that with you, because I know that we discussed it, but just keep me in the loop if you don't mind in the
Yes, ma'am,
future.
absolutely.
I do agree, and I do agree with Councilmember Appel, and I've talked with these homeowners, but not the rest of the community.
Yeah.
So I agree, Councilmember Appel. I'm
So,
leery
Parker,
of.
we would also, I'm not sure if there's an active neighborhood association there. We work through Meg Thompson and Becca, our neighborhood services people. And if there is an opportunity to get the word through their neighborhood association to anybody that could be affected, obviously, I think a lot of people use that road, not just the people that live adjoining to it. So we'll make sure we get input from everybody so we don't have any situations like we've had in the past where we've had some closures.
Yes, and if it's okay with the committee, I would just request, make sure that those signs are big and everyone can see them. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right, thank you, Councilor Parker. Any other comment? Well, do we have a motion on the floor? Did we get a
Yes,
first?
sir.
We do.
Okay, call the question. All in favor of setting the public hearing, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Ayes have it. Down to item E, acceptance and dedication of rights of way. Item 1, the point at Roads Crossing. Alteration.
Mr. Chairman, this is a development which is off of Sanders Road, off of Bees Ferry Road. And
Okay,
it's 75 lots and everything's been constructed, inspected, and accepted. And we would therefore recommend that those roadways listed on the agenda be entered into the city roadway system by acclamation of council.
So moved.
probably moved. Any seconds out there?
Second.
Any more discussion on this? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Item 2, Battery Hague Phase 2. Mr.
Yes, sir.
O'Brien.
This is a very small portion of South Shore Drive, which is West Ashley. And this is just 8 lots, a very small development, which also that portion of the road has been constructed, accepted, and inspected. So we would therefore recommend that be brought in.
All right, pleasure to
Move for
committee.
approval.
Properly moved and
Second.
seconded. Any more discussion on this small subdivision? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. Item F, temporary encroachments. Mr. O'Brien, anything unusual there?
Sir, nothing unusual. We do have, I just want to call note at 125 King, this is for 2 very small tables and chairs, but it's not for dining. It's just to allow, with us being a great walkable city, sometimes we get requests from some businesses to have a place for people to sit down and relax and enjoy the street. And this is the sidewalk's wide enough there. We've measured it and everything. So we're going to recommend and allow that temporary encroachment of those benches. I'm sorry, those chairs and tables. Other than that, that's it.
Councilman Shiade.
Is this Miller's all day?
Yes, sir.
Farley?
Yes, sir.
I thought.
All right, any more questions on this? Motion, please.
So moved.
Probably moved and seconded by council member. Who's going to second this?
I'll second.
Okay, council member Appel. Hearing no discussion, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right. Any opposed? Actually, that was for information, really. Item G, public service update, approval of an ordinance, the mayor to execute on behalf of the city a 2-year renewable. This is on Alexander Street.
Yes,
We
sir.
discussed this.
Julia has prepared an ordinance to come before council. I'm going to let her, if she's got anything she'd like to add, but basically there were some requirements which we recommended, which council put on in order for them to do, and that's to have a complete concrete apron. And Julia, you have anything else you want to add on that?
Yeah,
No, actually, Tom, that was lovely. We were in front of you guys, I think, last committee meeting, and
that's right.
and you instructed us to come back with a license agreement. This is a 2-year renewable. And yes, we do have the option to block it with 24 hours notice if we have an event or anything like that. And they do have to put the concrete apron in and
Yeah,
finish the driveway.
We had a good hearty discussion at the last meeting. I think it was a workable compromise. It passed real estate moments ago and asked for its approval today. What's the pleasure?
So moved.
Second.
Probably moving second. Any more discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Mr. Chairman,
Any
before we move on to stormwater, I do have one little quick update I'd like to give the
Yes,
committee.
sir. Yes, sir.
As we all know, we've had garbage and trash issues lately. Talked with Matt about 20 minutes before we came on, and we're starting to, I think, turn the corner on that. We predict it fell actually about 5 to 5 that we're going to complete all garbage and trash routes on time today for Monday. I will let you know that we still are using council under, the request we made and with assistance from Amy and her office and the mayor and council. We have the ability to use our 2 contract companies. That would be Trident and Capital Waste. And Trident actually did run a garbage route for us West Ashland today, which allowed us to finish on time. So we're very thankful for that. And we're going to continue to hopefully augment, support our staff as we continue to move and get back on normal schedule to get everybody collected in the same week they're due.
Great, thank you. Councilman Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Tom, thanks for that, because I had asked for that to be on our agenda, was an update. And I think the last discussion that we had was regarding this limiting the size of the loads. And I think we've moved into a discussion of whether or not we want to just do that yard debris every other week instead. So I don't know where we kind of stand with all that. But I would suspect most of us on representing parts of West Ashley have gotten calls. It's calmed down significantly. And I think y'all caught up, and y'all do a great job. I really do appreciate on
To
this.
address that, you may recall, I think last fall or maybe earlier this spring, we had some ordinance revisions which we brought before y'all, and we had some pretty good discussion. We're asking Julia and her staff are looking at those now. We're looking at them again to do and come up with a report. And once we get everything in a position where we feel the numbers and some of those requirements for measurements that you mentioned and things like that, we will be we'll get in with y'all to come back on the committee and make some recommendations. But we're still looking and trying to finalize those as we speak.
Okay. They just wanted to keep us, make sure the ball was going down the court with this thing. And
I think if it so be the committee's desire, we'll just add a normal update every Public Works committee to let y'all know where we're at.
okay. That'd be great. Thank you, Tom.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we carried the motion on item G.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Fountain, you're up. H1.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So
Yes, sir.
H1 is a amendment to our professional services contract with Wolpert. This is the Church Creek specific amendment, or Church Creek specific professional services contract. In this case, it is primarily used for plan review of incoming development projects under the kind of what we call the master watershed model that Wolpert maintains for us in that basin. We've had some changing conditions on some of the parcels due to some beaver dams, so we're looking at updating the modeling for tailwater conditions that we give to development projects.
Okay. Hopefully this is an easy one. It's a pleasure for the committee. The motion up.
Move for approval.
Properly moved and seconded. You have any input, Councilman Bowden?
No, I'm just,
All right, good.
always happy to see money being spent in this part of West Ashley.
All right, good. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. Item H2, floodplain, potential restrictions for floodplain construction.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is just bringing the committee up to speed on some initial discussions we've had with I shouldn't say initial, it's been some ongoing discussions with a stakeholder work group. There's been a number of proposals over the last few years of looking at ways to restrict fill, restrict the impacts of fill, especially on flooding within low-lying areas. One of the proposals we had come up with the work group was looking at potentially restricting the use of slab on grade foundations, which generally incentivize fill because you need to build your ground floor elevation up to be able to put your concrete slab in above the city's design flood elevation under the FEMA flood maps. So we've had a pretty involved and I'd say wide represented work group. We've got people from the developers, from home builders, we have environmental groups, other stakeholders, interest groups, the realtors, Chamber of Commerce has talked with us about it. So it's been pretty wide ranging, trying to figure out what impact would this have on people and what are the interests. I'll say currently we've been targeting the 100-year floodplain as a method that is relatively well regulated already, and obviously is the focal point of heavy fill usage in order to get those foundations up out of the floodplain. We've been looking at a residential focus, not impacting certain commercial and industrial buildings that basically normally need a slab on grade style foundation. Typically there's a heavier support there, but if you're building a warehouse, if you're building certain commercial, you really can't elevate practically, or schools, for instance, institutional buildings. And those are eligible for flood proofing. So typically they won't pay for fill. They'll actually go for commercial flood proofing instead to be able to build buildings in that manner. And then one of the areas we've been talking about quite a bit is how this will impact height of buildings. And that's obviously a sensitive subject in Charleston. It's kind of an interesting one that will come back for further discussion, most likely with the Planning and Zoning Department for potential ordinance revisions, rather than being instinctively a part of this one. But you know, as you fill the ground, you end up building a taller building if you do slab on grade foundations. But if you don't fill the ground and instead you build an elevated foundation method like a crawl space or a drive under, you end up with more stories, even though the top of the building ends up at a very similar elevation to what it would have been if you'd filled the ground. So the buildings look taller, and they are, compared to the ground level. So that's been one that's an interesting discussion point. Obviously, I think obviously the building community would appreciate more flexibility in how to set up that vertical spacing, where they get some advantage basically for not elevating a slab. Instead, they have more usable space. I don't think that's without merit, though there's certainly considerations from the zoning and planning department that they're looking at. So that was my quick summary. I think what we're looking for committee input on, Mr. Chairman, is how to, and again, we don't need to necessarily finalize anything today. It's just an input discussional process to come back and have later discussions about it before we bring you in a draft ordinance. But we are looking at whether the 100-year floodplain is the right target, or whether to move to like a 500-year floodplain, which is shaded zone X in flood maps. We don't currently, as a city, really do much regulation in that area, but it's certainly more protective. So there's just been discussion back and forth of either option. We are looking for, again, whether to focus that elevated slab on, whether to focus on residential, detached residential, and then there's been some back and forth on attached single family, so townhomes, on whether they should also be required to be traditionally elevated with no fill, or whether we would consider a what's called an elevated slab, where you basically build vertical stem walls on the sides of your slab and fill only directly underneath the foundation, but you don't actually elevate it with like a crawl space underneath. Those are less, obviously that's a less resilient method of construction because you can't elevate it later by jacking the building up as easily. But typically with very large buildings like townhomes, you're somewhat less likely to be able to elevate inexpensively anyway with the construction methodologies. So that's been an area, and I'll send you all a summary on these talking points. I don't expect you all to memorize it today, but we also looked at that, again, that discussion of vertical considerations. Would we be okay with basically allowing a non-inhabitable floor is not counting towards the story limit in a building? And then lastly, just wanted to emphasize our current approach is not tying any of this to like valuation, substantial improvement, substantial damage. It's only if you were installing a new foundation for the building. So if you do have a building that is completely torn down and you rip the foundation out, yes, you'd have to build an elevated foundation, but there wouldn't be like you have damage to your roof, therefore you're going to have to come back and change your foundation out, because that starts to be a higher burden for a homeowner. So we tied it to, if you're installing a new foundation, it's going to have to be one of these elevated methodologies, again, for residential structures. So those are the four initial talking points. I'm happy to do those one at a time, or if there's any general thoughts from the group, and we can certainly come back at a later date for a more involved discussion.
Yeah, let me do it. It's number hands, Councilman Shaheed, then the mayor, and then Councilmember Appel. In that
Thank
order.
you, Mr. Chairman. And Matt, I'm having flashbacks of meetings we had with the roundtable discussions on the manual. So this is not covered in our renewed manual.
So in the new manual, we did have coverage on how basically the displacement of water from fill
Right.
is prevented. Basically, you're not allowed to just displace that water onto someone else's property and flood them for development projects. if you're doing a single small structure, we don't have a lot of ordinance coverage on that on a single residential structure. So like an infill property, for instance, there's very little regulation in the city currently for a single home being built. There are regulations if you have multiple homes being built, if you're in a development, or if you're in a larger, above a half acre of development on a smaller parcel, but we don't have anything for individual infill. And then this one is supposed to sort of tie into that a little more, Councilman, in terms of trying to limit some of the ecological damage of fill, which we don't cover in the stormwater manual, and also trying to make homes more resilient for the future and that they're easier to elevate additional feet if they're built on a crawl space than if they're built on a higher slab, basically.
I just thought we had covered all of that, because I just remembered, and Councilman Appel shaking his head no, but I just kind of thought we had covered those kind of contingencies when we were having those discussions among, but maybe not. I mean, I just sort of it's running together now. But if this is something we need to address, certainly we need to cover that loophole or that missing link on these issues. So glad to do it. I just assumed we had done all of that because it was very thorough discussions we had with several stakeholders as we're going through those workshops. So
we did certainly incorporate many of the concerns, but it wasn't kind of as all encompassing as an approach like this would be. It did have still gaps within it because we only covered what was basically covered by this, what developments are covered by the stormwater manual. And we didn't necessarily address construction methodology, like making sure your house basically could be elevated in the future if you know there was a severe flooding issue.
okay, well, thanks for that clarification then. Appreciate it.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Matt, and other staff members that have been a part of these discussions. I was at a meeting I'll share just a couple of weeks ago at the Chamber of Commerce, and even though they admitted that everybody didn't agree on everything so far, but that they were all complimentary of being included and being part of the discussion, and felt like we had come a long way towards having consensus on these requirements about fill and building on slab. So I would suggest that we move forward and get a written ordinance before us to consider. And I would, the question, I don't know what specific questions would help give guidance at this point, Matt, other than the one you raised about the 100 and 500 year floodplain. I think my take would be to let's get something passed, and there seemed to be consensus on the 100-year floodplain. Let's go ahead and put the line there and get something in place, see how it works. We can always extend it further later on, but to get something done that we have consensus on now would seem to make sense to me. Thanks.
Councilmember Appel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say that I've been very impressed by how this discussion has unfolded over the last several months. As Matt alluded to, there is a working group of every notable business, development, environmental, and historic preservation group that has been involved in these discussions. Dale Morris, I got to give him a shout out. He's been excellent throughout this process as well. And we're doing this, I think, the right way, which is, you know, some folks have some ideas, they want to get it vetted, comes to council, comes to committee, and before we have our staff spend the time and energy and resources drawing up an ordinance, we want to make sure this gets vetted properly and goes through committee just to see if this is even something we want to tackle. That seems to be the case that it is, and I know that there's several of us that similarly have been involved in some of these discussions as well. But, you know, we've heard over the years, ban, fill, and build. That's not a policy. That's a bumper sticker, right? This is what that actually looks like when it's done in a very smart, reasoned, balanced manner, because this stuff gets very complicated. The intersection between different departments, zoning, public works, stormwater, et cetera. This has to be done very thoughtfully, and that's what we're doing. And the bottom line is, this is going to prohibit some of the worst building practices in the worst places. This is what the Dutch dialogues was all about. And this is something we can do now. This is not something we need to wait for the zoning overhaul for, or for some other plan to come on the horizon. This is something that we can take tangible steps on today. Well, not literally today, but today-ish, y'all know what I'm saying, to actually move the ball forward so we can go back to our constituents, and we can go back to the public and say, we are taking discrete, enforceable action to prevent some of the worst, we're learning our lesson. I mean, Councilman Bowden, Church Creek, that's a lesson for us to learn. This is going to prevent some of those same bad development practices and bad development decisions moving forward, which ultimately is in the best interest of everybody, the taxpayer, or homeowners that buy into these situations. And it's ways that we can actually show that the ball is being moved forward. So I could not be more proud of the process that's transpired so far. I'm not a technical expert when it comes to these issues, but we've got some of the brightest minds covering all the different perspectives talking to each other, which I think is great. And I think that I fully support us taking the next steps, drawing up an ordinance, and then having that more specific conversation once we have something to look at. But I think this is a real opportunity for us as we move forward. And as we've seen, it can get pretty wet around here, as we've seen over the past 30 days or so. So I think this is really great, and hope we can continue to make some progress on this. Thank you.
Any other input from committee members? Let me say something. I actually believe that I agree with all that's been said, but I think an in-depth explanation needs to be given to the entirety of council. I think before an ordinance is done, and the reason I say that, we get quite a bit of information on the Public Works Committee, but we've got a number of new people on council. Fortunately, two of them, or at least one of them is on. You're not new anymore, Councilman McPhail, but Councilman Bowden is actually on the committee here. But and I'm sure some of the ones who've been on council visit this, as opposed to, I think this would fall in the category of what we had an ad hoc committee on not too long ago, last week, Mr. Mayor, on something important being held in the committee, and then coming forward in a couple of days or so to the entirety of council. This is one of those items that's been worked on for months and months, if not a couple of years, that's now bubbling up into a consensus. But I certainly would like not only the council members that's on this committee to know, but certainly all 12 council members to be up to speed and when they vote yea or nay on this one. So I'm glad to hear all the work. I've heard all the good work about Dale also, Councilman Pell. So I guess next steps on this one, Mr. Fountain, what do you recommend?
So I think, Mr. Chairman, that's exactly what we were looking for the type of input from the committee, is what process would we like to see this move forward with into ordinance drafting. So we could certainly put on the next Public Works Utilities agenda sort of a more detailed discussion and presentation that then we could report out at council as well, in preparation for determining whether we want to move forward with an ordinance and what exactly that would look like.
Listen, I think this is so important. I actually think we ought to have a workshop on this issue, okay, on just this issue. Again, all the council members in their entirety, if they choose to attend, fine. But bring them up to speed, let them know the pros and the cons. Let the professionals come and have their say. People from the commercial department, the environmentalists, and then we get to an ordinance that we all that makes sense for our city. But I don't, on this one, I don't want people to be partially informed. So
Good point.
I would ask Mr. Mayor that we maybe schedule a workshop on this, Mr. Fountain, and then you, instead of having another in-depth meeting on this, why don't we just schedule a workshop, and then you come with your information, and recommend others to come and speak to us as well.
Yeah, so I don't know if anybody on legal staff has been drawing anything up yet. Could I just respectfully suggest that we get the outline of ordinance before having the workshop, so we can have, pretty definitive options to have discussion points around. Does that make sense? I don't know how hard that.
Well, I just, Mr. Mayor, frankly, I think that's maybe pushing it forward a little too fast. If I think some more information needs to be had, and I think the ordinance that would subject to come forward would be, let's put it like this, more improved. I think Mr. Fountain, you made mention about bringing more descriptive information maybe to the next Public Works meeting. If you want to do maybe after that, and even invite other council members, but I feel confident that a number of council members don't have the information on this one, as maybe some on this committee already possess. So, and this is going to affect the whole city. So I think we don't want to ramrod this one through.
Well, it'll certainly affect the 100-year floodplain, which is what, about half of the city?
Yeah, that's all.
So,
this kind of reminds me of the floodplain, but +2. I mean, not flood, I mean, FEMA +2. And remember we went roundabout on that quite a bit. And
right.
not so much for new housing, but for some of the existing pieces in particular, were to have 50% of damage other than from flooding. So tree comes through a house, tornado, then they have to come back up to. I don't know how that would affect this as well, but I surmise it would. So I need more information.
All right, well, I'll ask Jennifer to poll everyone and see when a good time we can all get together and have a joint discussion and quote workshop on this. That'd be fine.
All right, great. Thank you.
That'll move it along. That'll be good.
I agree. That's in an agenda. I do have something that I'm going to add to my committee's agenda here. On the last rain events last week, I represent an older district, West Ashland. A lot of it is low line. On some of these houses on slab, just what we talk about right now. Today, those houses would not be built, even with the existing rules, without the slab on grade. That potential coming forward. Without rules today, those houses would not be built in the East Oak Forest area or West Oak Forest area. In some cases, Ardmore, Sherwood Forest areas. But there are a number of areas in the district that I'm proud to represent that flooded during a low tide. Now, when properties flood during a low tide, that really has nothing to do with sea level rise. That has to do with a ditch that's clogged, or a ditch that needs to be larger, or small pipes, or larger pipes need to be put in place, or the outfall. Those three, that combination of the three. I happen to go to a couple of areas that water went into people's homes. One area in particular, Mr. Fountain, we actually tore down 2 of the houses. This is in East Oak Forest. And while I was taking a picture of the water, a lady happened to be 2 houses away on her deck, an elderly lady, and she didn't know who I was. And she shouted at me just for me to hear. She wasn't mad or anything like that. She was just raising her voice because I was about 2 to 3 houses away from her. And she shouted with confidence, they aren't going to do anything. In other words, no reason to take this picture. When she said they, she's talking about us, talking about the city. And I also spoke to one couple, the husband's disabled and the wife is battling the cancer. And their house was flooded probably in the last 10 years, it's flooded at least a third, at least 3 times, a little more than 3 times. And strictly from, not because of high tides and we get 5 inches of rain. In this particular case, it flooded last week again on a low tide. So I wanted to put on the agenda the areas that flood during low tide. And I mean, I don't mean flood the streets. I mean, where water goes into people's homes. I'd like that to be identified if we could, because I know the district I represent isn't the only one. I know Councilman Shade has a street or two in his area. Councilmember Pell, I think you got 1 or 2 in your areas. I don't know, Councilmember Bond, you probably do too. And I think somehow we need to put a priority on those areas, Mr. Mayor, respectfully, in that some of these areas we've known about since I've been on council and certainly you've been there. And right now, that area that that lady spoke to me about, she's right. We aren't doing anything. And when you sit down and you talk to a person who's been in a house 45 years and they've been flooded a number of times, you know, fixed incomes, right? Matter of fact, disability income, and elephant ears are literally in the ditch right next door to them that overflowed. Our job is not to give excuses. And we're in the position now of having to give, frankly, excuses, not because of any department heads, not because of you, Mr. Mayor, but we, you and the 12 council members, we got a problem in that regard where I don't think anybody's house in the city of Charleston should flood during a low tide. I just don't. And that's a component of the most inexpensive way to fix a drainage problem. Clean a ditch, widen the ditch, get larger pipes, clean the outfall. We can't get a more cost-effective problem to fix. And when we get these, you know, deep shafts and all of that, and all the, you know, pumps that have to go underneath the English Channel and things like that, I agree, those are huge challenges, but not gravity flow. Gravity flow, if there's an area that we should be proficient at as a town, and the example to others is gravity flow. And right now, Councilmember Shade, I know as well as I do, I don't know specifically Councilmember Pell and Bowden, but some of the areas we have that flood are strictly due to commercial areas that have been allowed to flow through residential areas. And the majority of those commercial areas were done prior to retention ponds and that type, you know, holding water on your property for a certain period of time. Now, I sure thought 4 or 5 years ago, I asked and I thought was passed to bring some of these old a requirement to bring some of these old shopping centers into compliance. And if we haven't done that, I want that to be checked. So if Ms. Copeland can check into that, or legal can check into that, I'd be very appreciative. Because if that time has run, the areas like Ashley Town Landing need to carve out a portion of property. Councilman Shea, hold their water for a while before it runs through, what is that, Charlestown 3 or Charlestown 4, whatever it does over there. Southeastern Galleries and the Crab Shack shopping center, areas like that, ought to hold some water on their site before it runs through Orleans Woods. I also took pictures around the mall during that period of time, videos. And the area that our team, Mr. Fountain and his team cleaned out, the big old canal that runs in front of Citadel Mall, Mr. Mayor, it was over flooded to where it looked like a lake. And I've got the video, I'll push it out to all of you. So the canal has been cleaned, but that issue of it, I guess, getting underneath 17 and out, underneath Savannah Highway 17 and out to the Stono, there's some kind of blockages there because it's a domino effect. The water's backing up like I don't know what. And again, in this case, in people's home, I had a first-time home buyer call me, and he literally was watching the water, praying it didn't come into his house. He actually moved the car to higher ground, hoping the water didn't come in. These people in this particular subdivision have a lagoon that catches the water off of their subdivision actually pretty well. but there's water coming from, and it's privately owned. All the property lines go out into that. It's not city retention area, but there's a big ditch that comes from the public that runs a lot of water into it, which is causing it to overflow. I saw it with my own eyes last week. So there's some fixes that we can do over there while we're in this budget process that I think we need to wrap up in areas that when it floods on a low tide, homes are threatened with water intrusion. So that's what I want placed, because I don't know where all those areas are, but I know where they are in the district that I represent. I know a couple of them where other people represent. And to be building up, even discussing potentially building a $1 billion plus wall around the city and not address water that's coming in people's homes today, or having some sort of priority list there, I think we can do better. So that's why I'm asking for this to be, I'm not pointing the finger at anybody, because it's part of my problem, which means it's part of our problem. But I think there's a solution out there, and with 13 heads and professional staff that we got, we can come up with some answers. With that, Mr. O'Brien, if you and Mr. Fountain, if you see that would be placed on the agenda, I'd be very appreciative. Councilman Shea, I saw your hand.
And I know you know the areas that you and I are talking about, and because part of our district sort of intersect at certain points, and the street off of Gilmore,
That's right.
Right down the cul-de-sac, and some of it, quite frankly, is that some of these drains got paved over, and some of the new construction on outlying areas in Charlestown Estates started getting flooded. There's simple solutions to a lot of this stuff. I think there's simple solutions. I may be wrong on that, but it's having low tide flooding, or even these rain bombs that occur, which seems like the whole month of August. I know Matt has been inundated with calls and emails that we all got on our residents complaining about the water coming in at the high tides. And I hate to say it's the usual suspects, but after you've been on council a number of years, you see this recurring theme keep on rising again and again. So glad to have that back on the agenda, Mr. Chairman, and have some more discussion about it. It's an ongoing issue. We're tackling it. It's becoming more frequent, unfortunately. But we do need to look at this low tide phenomena of flooding our residents, even to the point that if we can just control it by sometimes a matter of inches, it will prevent it from coming into the living quarters of some of these homes. And if that sounds kind of minuscule, but it makes a huge difference for a lot of people that they're not worried about their bathrooms being flooded or coming into their living room or their kitchen, and impacting their quality of life, because that water damage hits. It's a long-term fix. It's not a short-term solution to it. So if we can, coming into the yard is one thing, but coming into the living quarters is a totally different animal. So if we can address even that type of solution, that's a huge benefit to a lot of our citizens.
Well, one way to get them identified is for all council members to look. I know council member, probably the only council member that may not have an area, and I'd say may, I don't know, is maybe Councilman Gregg, because Daniel Allen was built with the best of engineering. Well, they had the best of engineering at the time, and certainly more modern and all of that. They didn't fill in creek beds, and then put houses on. Councilman Appel.
Yeah, so you would think that this would be a very simple issue to solve. And sometimes it is. Sometimes it's the matter of an outfall pipe that's been silted in, and we can operate within that little zone that doesn't require literally federal agencies to get involved, which is on its own insane. And thank goodness we're finally beginning to make some regulatory reform happen with the state and federal regulators. But in my district, at least, what we get into, and I'm sure there's similar situations over in District 5 and over in District 9, is I'm sorry, District 7.
Right.
Is that you don't have public storm water easements in the right places. So in some of the older neighborhoods I represent, you've got this flooding problem.
Right.
But in order for the city to get involved and get in there and actually start doing work in these areas, the city has to obtain easements. We worked on a project over in Old Windermere in the Crescent where those two neighborhoods intersect.
I remember.
And I'm telling you guys, it took over a year to get those easements platted. I had to, go and walk in this ditch with the neighbors. It took a lot of grinding to get that done, and incredible job by Matt and his department. Chip McQueenie, remember him? He helped tremendously on drafting up all these documents. It is not easy stuff, but it's something that's really worth the effort. And really each of these situations has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis because of the complexity that goes into some of these situations. And I've found Matt and his department to be excellent in relatively efficiently kind of getting to the nub of what the issue is. I mean, we've got that really good, I think it's the LiDAR data. I hope I'm not blowing that technical concern, but the reality though is, and I don't want to be negative or pessimistic here, but sometimes there's not a whole lot that can be done. I mean, when we get absolutely inundated over a period of 30 days and you start getting these rain events around high tides and we have very little to no elevation, you could have the best drains, the best ditches, the best outfalls, and there's still no solution. But we got to do the best we can. And even if we can make some improvement at the margins, it matters a lot. One of the things that Matt taught me, and I've learned a whole lot from Matt over the last several years, is that oftentimes the measure of progress when it comes to flooding is not so much preventing flooding, because that is an inevitability in so many of these situations because of what I just mentioned. But the true measure of success is how fast can the water get out when the rain stops and the tide goes out. And really that, I think, helps alleviate some of the worst problems for people, is standing water in places, things of that nature. So I just encourage everybody, and poor Matt, I can't even imagine what your inbox must look like. I hope I don't bother you too much. I try to pick my battles, but really it is a case-by-case situation. And a lot of times you really have to get in there with the neighbors, and some people don't like giving up easements. Right? I mean, you gotta convince people, you gotta work with people, but we all gotta take responsibility for, making those improvements happen at the margins. A lot of these neighborhoods were developed in a very poor manner. That's what we're trying to get away from with some of these new prospective changes we were talking about a minute ago. But we're doing a great job. I mean, I can speak for my district. There's been tremendous improvement in some really rough places, and we still got a lot of work to do, but I appreciate you bringing that forward.
Well, listen, that piece about, I agree with 95, 99% of what you said. I'm really talking specifically areas that flood during low tide, because a number of these areas, at least that I'm familiar with, a number of them were created. These places didn't flood before. In other words, Orleans Woods floods because of allowing probably almost a dozen commercial developments to flow through that neighborhood. Okay, I'm very familiar with that area since I was 12 years old, and I'll be 67 in a week and a half. So one of at Charlestown, is it 3 Councilman Shade on the back part of Ashley Town Landing there, where the magistrate office used to be over there. That area, that neighborhood back there floods because of the water that's coming off of Ashley Town Landing that's running through there. It had nothing to do with high tide or low tide. So I think there may be in particular West Ashley, a number of other areas like that. So these flooding problems have been created because as projects got developed, it was cost effective instead of running it to the Highway 61 drainage system, run it through a neighborhood ditch. And nobody kept up with them. After a while, something's being approved in the county, something being approved in the city. The next thing you know, the neighborhood is the one that's being flooded. So anyway, but you'd be surprised with just like that easement you got for people to sign off on, it took more than a year to do. I don't know, is that ditch in, Mr. Fountain, has that ditch been put in there on that easement that Councilmember Pale referred to? Has that been installed?
So there were a number of discussions with Councilman Pell. The main one that we normally talk about, the ditch work has been accomplished. We actually, I probably need to tell Councilman Pell, we just received the core permitting work. Finally, yes, I was very happy. So we actually put out for bid on Friday the outfall cleaning work based on that core permit work through the legal department, heroically reviewing something very late in the evening on Friday.
All right, great.
But that was, as Councilman Bell mentioned, that was 17 months of review time for that permit.
Listen, there was a ditch that was put in Sherwood Forest. But for that ditch, I think the whole thing cost $150,000. But for that additional ditch, 2 houses would have flooded last week. Those houses did not flood. I rode around during the height of the event to see if the ditch was functioning. And I'm talking, one of them has an 86-year-old lady that's disabled. Her daughter's taking care of it. Water did not come in her house. And I was just proud of, boy, that little ditch actually did work. Okay. So these little projects in these old areas, we get a lot of bang for the buck for them. And in this budget process, Mr. Mayor, hopefully along with the men, the councilman, we got to look on the rocks and stones to find extra dollars for stormwater as well as our, obviously our general fund budget to pay our people so properly. But anyway, I've talked longer than I wanted to on that, just to get an item on the agenda that I chair. But anyway, so any other input?
Move that we adjourn, Mr. Chairman.
By acclamation, we stand adjourned. See you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Mr. Fountain, you gonna be around for a few minutes? I can give you a quick call.
Is that right for me, Councilman Shade?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Alicia may have feelings about that, but yes, you can certainly give me a call.
All right, I won't keep you long, I promise.
No
Thanks.
problem. Thank you.
Bye-bye.